Greetings to everybody here joining us today for our special presentation with Cred MB. That's the Coalition for Responsible Energy Development. Now, the Atlantic Canada Climate Network is focused on presenting all sides and opinions in a balanced way to ensure that we are able to hold accountability, build credibility and transparency, and ensure all voices are heard. So, welcome to our first edition of Balancing the Conversation. Before we begin, I want to respectfully recognize and acknowledge the relationship that the First Nations, Inuit, Métis across Canada have with the land all Canadians live on and enjoy. We would like to recognize that the ACCN operates on the traditional unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqiyik, Passamaquoddy, Penobscot, and Abenaki nations, or the Wabanaki Confederacy, as well as Innu and Inuit peoples. This territory is covered by treaties of peace and friendship, with these nations first signed with the British Crown in 1726. These treaties did not deal with the surrender of lands and resources, but in fact established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. So it is in this spirit of peace and friendship that I greet you all today. It also reminds us that each of the 634 First Nation communities, the 53 Inuit communities, and 8 Métis settlements have a unique historical, cultural, spiritual, and environmentally sustainable connection to the land that their people and ancestors have inhabited since time immemorial. So we encourage all Canadians and visitors to these lands to learn about and regularly acknowledge the historic and current relationship that exists between the unceded lands on for which we live and work and thrive, and of course the First Nation, Inuit, and Métis also as well. We also encourage all Canadians to consider how they can personally contribute to Canada's reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. The world is transitioning to a clean, non-emitting power systems, but the old guard continues to cling to legacy power plants and propose wildly expensive and unproven new small reactor designs, while affordable, innovative, renewable energy solutions race ahead. This is a statement by Cred NB, and we will explore the current state of renewable energy, its reliability, a state-of-the-art technology and technology coming to market, and solutions, of course, for New Brunswick's energy system. Our presenter, Tom McLean, is retired from a career in software development to focus on contributing to climate change action, especially in the realm of green power and electrification. He follows the rapidly accelerating developments in the global clean energy industry while looking for effective and affordable solutions for New Brunswick. He's also presented to the New Brunswick Standing Committee on Climate Change and Environmental Stewardship on transitioning to renewable energy, and to the Select Committee on Climate Change on electric vehicles. So it's with humble gratitude that we are going to welcome our wonderful and esteemed presenter here today. Thank you for setting the time aside to spend it with us. And we're very grateful. So this is going to be recorded and uploaded onto YouTube for you to share afterwards or to review. And for anybody who was not able to make it, for you to tune in for the first time. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Tom. Thank you, Tom.
Well, thank you very much. I much appreciate it. I very much appreciate the opportunity to present to the group, and thank you to the Atlantic Canada Climate Network for the opportunity. Well, let's see. Make sure my little laser pointer is working here. Yep, good. Hope I won't burn up the screen. Okay, so welcome everyone. I like starting off with the sheep with the solar panels, just to show that solar panels can actually coexist quite nicely without taking up land all by themselves. But let's get to it here. As Ashley just mentioned, there certainly is a need for urgent action, and that's certainly a big part of why I'm here and doing the work that I'm doing. The global warming crisis that we have is marching forward, and the world has committed to reach net zero emissions by 2050 to keep it below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And of course, Canada has made commitments that we're going to make sure that we support that net zero emissions target. And in part, what we're doing is reducing our emissions with electricity to hopefully net zero by 2035, starting with reducing our coal fire power by and eliminating it by 2030. The electricity part of the solution, part of net zero, is an important part. One of the big things about electricity is that it's very clean, it's very efficient. So one of the strategies that people have taken to heart worldwide is electrify, electrify, electrify. Take as many things that we're currently burning stuff and turn it into electrically driven stuff. And of course, a big part of that, making sure it really works for us in getting to net zero, is making sure that electricity only comes from non-emitting sources. And that's obviously a key part, because already electricity in the world is a big source of greenhouse gas emissions. But the globe of the world has taken that to heart, and there's been a huge electrification process going underway of transport and heating and cooling, which are big sources of greenhouse gas emissions, and among other things, for sure. Those are the two biggies, though. And there's been explosive growth in wind and solar generated power. Yeah, I just wanted to recap a couple terms here, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. First one is power, and power is measured in watts. A few watts here, a few watts there, and pretty soon you have 1,000 of them, and that's called a kilowatt, or abbreviated kW. Then we have 1,000,000 watts, MW, or gigawatt, sorry, a megawatt, then gigawatt and terawatt. Just basically multiply by 1,000 to get each of those terms. Then energy is power that's being provided over time. So hence you have watt hour. And in fact, you probably see in your residential electricity bill the term kilowatt hour, or kWh. It's just simply 1,000 of those watt hours. Then you have megawatt hour, gigawatt hour, and terawatt hour. So as you can see, there's a big difference between that little h being there or not. The h stands for hour, and it makes it an energy term, whereas power is just an instantaneous measure of watts. An example I'll give here is a 100-watt light bulb, which of course are getting fewer and fewer. It needs 100 watts of power to light up, and that's instantaneous. But if you leave that light bulb on for, say, 10 hours, 10 times 100, that's 1,000 watt hours, or 1 kilowatt hour. And of course, there's lots of combinations of that. You can leave 10 light bulbs on for an hour, and they use 10 times 100, 1 kilowatt hour of energy. So the cost of that energy. One of the ways that analysts use to measure the different costs or compare different costs of energy sources is called levelized cost of energy. And that's where you take the cost of building the power plant, the cost of running it for 30 or 40 years, and the cost of decommissioning it and tearing it all down. And you take all that and you divide it by the amount of energy, or kilowatt hours or megawatt hours or whatever, that it was able to produce in a lifetime of that power plant. So it gives you a way of doing an apples to apples comparison between different power sources. And one of the things that's happened over the last less than 15 years, in fact, is that the cost of producing power that used to be for solar, for example, which used to be way up there, over 40 cents a kilowatt hour, has made a huge drop. A huge drop. In fact, this graph stops at 2021, but it's kept on going down. In fact, it's generally recognized to be the lowest cost of energy in the world right now. And onshore wind power and offshore wind power have also, their drops haven't been as huge, but they've basically dropped by half in the same period. So again, significant cost drops. And that's a major drop in the cost of power generation in an industry where you're really used to things happening over many decades, not just one.
This is great.
So the response to those
Yeah, he is.
drops has been, as you might expect, that as tracked by the International Energy Agency, is that this, as I'm going to show, it's kind of buried here, but there's an actual line that shows the increased use of wind generation continuing to arch up over the last 10 to 15 years. And all these other wavy lines all over the place here are the predictions that the International Energy Agency has been making about where they thought wind was going to go. And they've been pretty much right on. And it's interesting, their most recent predictions are their highest ones. So they're really expecting it to continue to grow. Again, the cost being a big factor, but also the need to, of course, the need to clean up our energy sources. Solar, similar track. That curve has been arching up quickly over the last 10 years, 10 to 15 years, and it's been taking off. Interesting, the IEA, or International Energy Agency, has been somewhat more pessimistic. You see all these predictions down here saying, oh, we don't think it's really going to go anywhere. And all of a sudden, oh, well, actually, maybe it is. And so they finally caught up, and their predictions now are showing it and actually taking off much more quickly, much more in line with where it's actually going. Interesting, the predictions for nuclear power have shown a somewhat different track. So here's the actual line again, which I guess the optimistic way of looking at that would be that it's been somewhat flat or moribund. It hasn't really shown much growth over the last period. Yet IEA has consistently said, oh, it's going to grow, it's going to grow, it's going to grow. And their most recent forecast says, well, it's going to grow a little bit maybe. And of course, a little bit of history there is that there's been a number of periods where the nuclear industry has said, we're going through a renaissance, things are going to take off, we have new reactors. Well, that sounds awfully familiar with the current state of SMRs. So in comparison, here's the amount of energy that's been generated by wind and solar, just wind and solar, not hydro or anything else, just wind and solar, in the world compared to the amount of energy generated by nuclear. As you can see, back in 2006, almost nothing for wind and solar, and there's nuclear. And all of a sudden, here we are, just a few, well, just about, I guess, 15 years later, and wind and solar has passed nuclear, which is still around about the same. So the world has really said, whatever the marketing pitches are, we're going with wind and solar in a huge way. And nuclear is still around, but it's really not doing a lot for us in terms of growth or taking care of new needs. Now, I've talked about the curves of costs and whatnot, where they're going. Let's look at the cost factor in New Brunswick. These figures are from the New Brunswick Power IRP, the recent 2023 IRP, where they talked about what the cost of generating electricity or energy is. As you can see, the sources which are emitting are quite a bit more expensive than the ones that are not, which again, that's great from the perspective we want to transition away from these things. And note that I actually include the Belledune biomass as an emitter as well. Dr. Mo Qureshi in the Conservation Council talked about this being a bad move to biomass in the Belledune, simply because it accrues a carbon debt, which will take many decades for trees to grow and get back. So it's not a good idea. In the non-emitting sources of power, you have at the very bottom here, look, onshore wind, then you have solar, and then you have imports primarily from Quebec Hydro and other places, offshore wind and geothermal, and then the most expensive was the large nuclear. And interesting, I had to actually go to the 2020 IRP because this figure was dropped from the 2023 one. I don't know why, and scaled up for $2023. So obviously we want to be using these lower cost sources of energy rather than the higher cost ones. And that's almost a factor of 3 between onshore wind and large nuclear. And do we have wind? Yes, yes, sir, we do. The darker is better. So in terms of offshore wind, no problem. Uh, and New Brunswick has tons of wind, as Nova Scotia and PEI. Newfoundland, like crazy, as anybody who's in Newfoundland can attest to. But back in 2008, Dr. Yves Gagnon at the University of Moncton did a study where we identified 41 gigawatts of wind in New Brunswick, 41 gigawatts. And I just have a little scale off to the side here that shows you, there's the 41 gigawatts. And this little orange bar here is the peak power generation that was needed in the last major winter cold strike that happened about a year and a half ago. So that's our peak power, and there's what the wind can provide. Now, this is a really gross comparison here, so it's not totally apples to apples, but it gives you an idea of just the sheer amount of wind potential we have that we can grab. Solar, yes, we have solar. Is it as awesome as the wind? Not really. It's good, no question about it. And there are areas of the province where it can be economically tapped into. The southern part of the province and the northeastern part of the province are the two that are the best. No question, it'd be a good complement to wind. In the summer when there's less wind and more sun, and in the winter, of course, there's less sun, but there's more wind. So it's a good complementary source of power. Balancing the grid. Yeah, we've got all this power, which is awesome, or all this energy that we can get from these cheap sources, but the power has to be balanced all the time. So it's great that we have a good supply of cheap energy, but we always have to be providing, the NB power has to always be providing the same amount of watts as the system or customers are demanding all the time, every second. Always has to happen. So balancing the grid is key. And that's when you start talking about firm resources and load following, all these other jargon pieces. But it all comes down to keeping this balance every second of the day. So if there's too much wind compared to load, then we have to curtail it or save it or do something. And vice versa. Same with if nuclear is running and we don't need it, then that's a problem. We have to do something else with it. So balancing the load, or balancing the grid rather, is an important concept that we have to take care of. And of course, it becomes a little more difficult, or a lot more difficult, depending on how you look at it, when we have wind that's blowing and we don't need power, or sun that's shining, we don't need it, or vice versa. It's not blowing or shining and we need it. So how to balance that? Well, typical things for balancing the grid are include these collection of items. I'll talk about interties first, and that's where you're grabbing power from other jurisdictions, typically neighboring jurisdictions that say, oh, we've got extra wind or whatever, so great, we'll pull it in. Super, awesome, let's do that. Or we've got extra wind and we'll ship it back to the other jurisdiction. Gas-fired generators, and when I say gas in this presentation, I'm talking about fossil gas or natural gas, however you want to refer to it. Gas-fired generators are typically used for balancing the grid because they're very flexible, they're fast-acting, and so they allow the operator to respond to shortages and gaps very, very quickly. But they're still an emitting source, so not a great one to use in a 100% renewable grid. Hydro dams are great, they're efficient, they're fast, but we've pretty well maxed out our hydro in the province, especially ones that can be dispatched or used on demand. And essentially that's max to quack. Geothermal, an awesome source, and we have lots of potential in the province, but we've used none of it, zero. So there are definitely options for balancing the grid, but in this list, it really comes back to these gas-fired generators, which is, I don't know, that's all right for short term, but I really I want to get away from gas fire. The good news is that we have a whole other set of tools that are coming on strong to allow us to balance the grid, and that's storage. The cost of lithium-ion batteries, you probably have heard about, has been dropping dramatically in the last while. It's all in the same period of everything else. And as you can see, the drop has been dramatic even just in the last 10 years, and it's continuing to drop. Not as much, but it's continuing to drop. And the world has responded by saying, "Holy cow! While we're taking on this solar and wind, we can use these battery storage facilities, or sorry, power energy storage facilities based on lithium-ion batteries to store it." And so it was practically nothing back in 2020, grown to 43 gigawatt hours, and the expected growth is going to be 10 times that. This is how many installations each year. So this isn't a cumulative. This is installations each year that they expect to go in. So it's huge. Now, this is a busy slide. I apologize for that. And I'm going to spend some time on each of these different types of storage. But if you take away nothing else from this, it's take away the fact that there's lots of different storage solutions for solving different types of storage and grid balancing problems. So that's the key message here. So excuse me while I get into this and try not to nerd and geek out too much here. Apologies if I do. So across the top here, we're talking about duration. So that is how much of a gap or shortfall can this storage fill in for? And it runs from seconds to months. That's the range. And going up here, we see these solutions, as I've got them on those steps here, they actually can store more and more energy. On the flip side is that as they store more energy, their efficiency goes down. And I'll talk in a minute about why that's not a big deal as you might think, but it's still important to consider. First, I'll tackle this thing called demand response in the bottom left. This is really the flexibility part of this slide of storage and flexibility. And that is where we're not really storing energy, but we're just pushing the need for energy off to a little bit later. And that little bit later could be a few seconds, or it could be a few hours. And the idea is that there are lots of times when, as a consumer or as an industry or as a commercial enterprise, you need energy, but you don't really need it right now. You can live with the having it a little bit later, and that can be done in an automated way where you have an agreement with the power utility to say, I'm going to allow you to maybe flick off my a power heater for a few seconds every now and then, and you'll give me a discount for doing that. And I probably won't even, in fact, I'm sure I won't even notice it, but it'll saves you having to take on power from other sources. And right up to demand response could be as simple as time-based rates, where I'm not going to run my dishwasher or clothes dryer until later on in the evening to save power and push it out of peak times. Lots of different tools in demand response, lots of things that can be done. NB Power is already budgeting, I think, 90 megawatts for just around demand response. Okay, lithium-ion batteries we've touched on. They're good for 1 to 4 hours. They're very efficient, very fast acting. They provide lots of great service. Once you get beyond 4 hours, they become a little bit too expensive for handling the bigger gaps. So then we have something called pumped hydro, not quite as efficient, but can store a lot of energy for several hours maybe more, maybe up to half a day or so. Very good facility. Takes a lot more room. Usually involves creating an artificial lake, which means flooding some land somewhere. So, although we have lots of good potential for those in New Brunswick, they do come with some downsides. Iron air batteries is one of the technologies I've been following lately that actually they're made out of iron. Oh, how simple is that? And so they're really cheap. In fact, about 10% of the cost of lithium-ion batteries, and they're good for handling gaps of up to 4 days. So a 4-day gap in power supply. That's pretty significant, and they're really, really cheap. Again, not quite as efficient, but it doesn't quite matter because of the ability to be so cheap. Stored hydrogen. Lots to talk about hydrogen, and I could have a whole other presentation on why most of that is not very fruitful, because hydrogen has very limited uses. But in terms of if you need to fill in gaps, especially over very frequent periods, and even very, very long gaps, could be days or weeks, then the ability to store hydrogen and keep it handy for a time when you need it, and to do that cheaply, is very powerful. And we actually have the right geography in or geology in New Brunswick to store hydrogen underground in salt caverns. Do that very cheaply, can stay there for months, years, very safely, very cost effective. And when the time comes and we need to use that to fill in power gaps, it's expensive because it's expensive to create green hydrogen, but it's non-emitting and it fills in those gaps without any problem. The last one I'll touch on here is seasonal thermal, and that's essentially taking waste heat that either from industrial process or commercial process, or even in the summertime when you're trying to get heat out of your house or your apartments and pump it somewhere else, instead of just going in the air, you pump it underground into thermal storage units, which are super cheap. They're basically dirt cheap because they're made out of dirt, and that heat can sit there and actually it sits there and will actually last until the winter time. So months later, you can then start drawing that heat out and use that to very efficiently heat your home or your business or your industry. So it's a very powerful mechanism. All these things are either in use and very mature technology, or they're in the process of being commercialized right now. And I can give you lots of examples of that. Okay. Let's talk about balancing again. So now we're again, we're still talking about balancing, but now we have these nice little things, storage and demand response that we just talked about, that actually allow us to balance that solar and wind, that unruly solar and wind power. And either if there's too much solar or wind, we store it. And if there's not enough, we take it back out of storage. And we use demand response to help us make sure that we can reduce our needs for storage and other sources. So it provides a great balancing mechanism to have those tools in place. And like I say, I've just covered off a few of the different possibilities, some of the top ones, some of my faves, but there are definitely lots more, and more coming all the time because there's so much effort and research being done into handling storage. So what's the payoff? Well, the payoff has been that 20 years ago, energy experts were saying there's no way you can add any more than 10% wind and solar to the grid. You just can't manage that. Well, now the world is actually going over 10% wind and solar integration. This is just wind and solar. This doesn't include all renewables. So the world has gone over 10%. In fact, Denmark went from 20% in 2010 to over 60% in 2022. So huge they've done some awesome stuff with how they integrate wind and solar, especially wind, and how they do that in their social networks. There's lots of great success stories there. And Spain and Germany and the UK, all up around 30%. In fact, Southern Australia, not Australia itself, but South Australia, the state, they've hit 70% integration of wind and solar, and they've recently said, we were going to be 100% wind and solar by 2030, but we're going to change that target to 2027. So in 3 years, they plan to be 100% wind and solar. So things are happening. That storage is making a lot of things happen. There's a lot of benefits around renewables. I won't go through them all, but one of the key ones in terms of the face in terms of the face of climate change is fast deployment. You can build solar panels, solar farms, arrays, and wind farms very, very quickly compared to other methods of generating electrical energy. Always like to touch on recyclable. Yes, you can recycle lithium-ion batteries. Yes, you can recycle solar panels. Yes, you can recycle wind turbines. In fact, wind turbines, most of the components of wind turbines can either be directly reused after the first 20 years, because that's about the typical life of a wind turbine, or they can be refurbished and reused, or even the blades, which tend to get lots of bad press, now are being reused as construction material. But even better is that the major manufacturers are now coming up with materials that they're using in their blades that can actually, when the blade is finished, it can actually be removed and rebuilt into new blades. So the ultimate in recycling. So yes, that issue is well underway. Now we're just waiting for that material to come around, because solar panels last for 30 years and so wind turbines last for 20. So it takes a while for those to actually come around so they can be recycled. Our neighboring province, Nova Scotia, has been on the move as well. They've done some great work. They when I've looked at their plan, it's interesting that they have a plan for getting to 80% renewable by 2030 and net zero by 2035. It does mention nuclear as a kind of off in the distance, something that could happen at some point, but it's not part of our plan, our main plan, and in fact, it's nowhere near a critical part of the plan. So, and I just wanted to read part of the conclusion from this Nova Scotia Clean Energy Solutions Task Force. The new energy system will be built upon cleaner, renewable energy resources that are homegrown, inexhaustible, and significantly less expensive. Nova Scotia's domestic renewable energy resources will be ultimately mitigate the cost of electricity, improve affordability, and create a competitive advantage for our communities, businesses, and industries. Way to go, Nova Scotia. So nuclear is not needed. It just isn't. Lots of reasons. I won't go through all of them, but I certainly wanted to touch on a few here. It's the most expensive source of power. It just is. Why would you want to use the most expensive when there's cheaper ones around? And in terms of balancing the grid, it's even gets more expensive to have a nuclear reactor sitting around waiting to fill in gaps. They want them to run all the time. Otherwise, they just get even more expensive than they are now. They generate lots of waste heat. That about 65 to 70% of the heat generated by a reactor isn't used to produce electricity. It just goes off into the environment. That's why they need to be cooled. And so that's usually some sort of impact into the local environment. And of course, the world is warming. We don't need more heat that we're not using. The International Energy Agency in COP 28, they took a message. They had 5 pillars to COP 28, and the top pillar, the number one part of the message was they believe the world needs to triple their use of wind and solar by 2030. None of the pillars mentioned nuclear. SMRs, well, the most advanced in terms of timeline project was a NuScale project in the US. It collapsed when they had to upgrade their price and show, well, this is how much it's going to cost. And their potential customers just simply walked away and said, no, not going to happen. The other thing about nuclear, of course, the SMRs are not magical. They're still going to, I won't go through the whole list, but they still produce radioactive waste. It's something that they're not going to get rid of. And there's no solution anywhere in the world for the most dangerous kind of waste, and that's the used nuclear fuel. Finland has built a deep geological repository, but it's still not licensed for use. They're still evaluating, and it's not a solution. It's just a way of putting the waste out of sight. So plan for New Brunswick. Well, New Brunswick needs to have a vision for 100% renewable grid. And in fact, the IRP talked about the fact that we could do this, but they just haven't studied it because they're keen on nuclear. Okay, well, that's a problem. Strong interties with Quebec and Nova Scotia, and not just because we think we need to be dependent on Quebec, but because we can develop a large wind resource and actually share power with Quebec and Nova Scotia. So when there's a drought, when there's Quebec hydro, we can share wind power with them. Same with Nova Scotia. So it's a codependency, not a dependency. It's called collaboration. Renewables and storage are available now, and they should be replacing the coal-fired power that we need to get rid of by 2030. Lots of different possibilities there, and I've listed just a few of them. Then we continue to transition those other resources that are emitting to or expensive to, again, renewables and storage. I point out here the dual fuel turbines. They're essentially the turbines that they can run on natural gas or gas, or they can run on hydrogen. And what it does is if we're going to replace a turbine or upgrade one, we should do it with a new style that are coming out that can, again, they can burn natural gas or a mix of natural gas and hydrogen, or then eventually just hydrogen. And that allows us to more easily transition, because gas is probably going to be the last emitting source we're going to use to balance the grid. And then lastly, seasonal thermal storage has lots of potential for use in New Brunswick, especially in commercial or industrial or urban areas, because it generally works best with district storage or district heating. Sorry. So in summary, the world is rapidly moving to renewables, no question about it, and they're clean. So that's part of the motivation for sure, and they're very inexpensive. Second part of it. We in New Brunswick have lots of potential. The wind for renewable resources, the wind is huge. Solar is definitely more than adequate, and although I didn't spend a lot of time on it, we actually have a very good geothermal potential here as well. Nuclear power is not needed. And really, now's the time that New Brunswick should be saying, what's the path that we need to be on to get to a 100% renewable grid, and let's get on it. Thank you. And now I believe there's some time for some questions.
Thank you, Tom. That was so informative. I think everybody here is feeling really great about your presentation, but there was a comment maybe to go into a little further of Mactaquack so the audience knows how precarious it is in terms of where it's at now and being past its lifespan.
Mactaquack, yes. The well, Mactaquack is a great source of hydropower for sure, about 600 megawatts of power. The it's actually termed a run-of-the-river power source because the amount of energy it can store behind its dam is only really a few hours worth. So it does provide some balancing capability, but not the best. Now sorry, not a huge amount. Now, one of the current project underway there, oh, I'm going to get it wrong here, but we're going to call it a refurbishment, the lifetime achievement refurbishment or something like that. And it allows it's going to allow the facility to reach its 100-year expected or planned lifespan, and so it's going to essentially take the existing facility and refurbish the construction and as well as the turbines and put in new gear so that the dam can continue to do the exact same job it has been doing. They don't expect it to the amount of power to increase, or they'll get some small improvements in efficiency, but really it's to keep the facility going as is.
Thank you for that. Does anybody have any questions that they would like to ask Tom? You could ask them in the chat or you can unmute yourself.
I have a question.
Please, Tylene.
Hi, Ashley. Hi, Tom. That was so
Hi.
good. Hi. Yeah, as you can tell from my comments, I'm just super pumped about everything you're presenting. That's very exciting, especially the parts about it being effective with cost and with usage. So that's really good to hear, especially in Alberta, because you hear a lot of rhetoric to the opposite of that. I would say the biggest thing that you didn't speak to, you did mention briefly, is just lithium batteries. Like you had many alternatives to them, which is so great to hear. But I do know there is a concern about mining for lithium and how much environmental destruction is caused by that. And I also have heard quite a bit about them not being able to be recycled, the lithium batteries, but you mentioned that they can be. So, okay, I'm glad that you're surprised with that. So I always think, you have to consider everything, even amazing things that are like renewable energy. You still have to look at all the impacts and what are the positives and negatives. So I was wondering I don't know if my question is very clear, but if you could just speak to lithium batteries as, I just hear like, well, lithium batteries, so no, we can't do that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So like, what are some of the ways that we can mitigate that, I guess?
Oh, absolutely. Okay. Yeah. Where to start? Okay. Yeah, lithium batteries. Let's see. Uh, the first, usually the first thing I hear about is the kids in the Congo that are mining cobalt for lithium batteries. And yeah, that's a horrible thing. No question about it. There's all kinds of bad practices, and not just with cobalt, but with other things in the world, including the extraction of oil and gas and coal. Well, first off, nobody ever talks about, you rarely hear about the fact that cobalt is used for processing or refining oil, or lots of other sources as well, or lots of other uses as well. Tend not to hear about those things. Okay, well, that's interesting. The next thing is that they've changed the chemistry, especially where we're talking about grid scale batteries for lithium that no longer use cobalt. Okay, so cobalt's no longer used for cobalt is used for the battery in your laptop or your phone though, but I don't see anybody throwing those out. Interesting enough. But anyway, then you mentioned lithium, And of course, there's other chemical or other minerals in batteries, but lithium is the new one that it's being pounded upon. Well, yes, and there are better and worse ways of mining lithium, no question about it. One of the new sources of lithium that has just come about is it's yet to be exploited. It's a place called the Salton Sea in the U.S., where they currently have a geothermal plant that actually brings up heated the slurry or liquid from the depths, and they extract the heat and they push it back down again. Well, they've discovered that this slurry they're bringing up just to extract the heat is rich in lithium. In fact, they figured that supply of lithium could supply the whole of the U.S. period, just from that one source. So, and of course, the environmental impact is next to nothing incrementally because they're already doing this. So there are other ways of actually extracting lithium, which are being used and it be expanded. Now, I'm sure there are still horror stories out there, and you can find those for mining any kind of mineral, but those are being replaced by better processes. So yes, you will find the horror stories, but there are far better ways of actually extracting and actually getting those minerals. The other thing I want to mention briefly about mining is that moving to renewable power energy will generate less mining, because you actually pull something out of the ground and then you use that for 10, 20, or 30 years, or in some cases, solar panels can last up to 50, and then you recycle it. Whereas you pull oil or coal or gas out of the ground and you burn it. And guess what most of the extraction is right now? Yeah. So yeah, there's definitely some bugaboos around this, and it's not perfect, no question about it. But in terms of cleaning up and looking and going towards better solutions, there's no doubt. Does that answer your question, I hope?
That is excellent. And sorry, did I miss it? That was so thorough. Thank you. I asked so many questions. And do you mind just speaking a little bit more about recycling lithium batteries? Like, is that possible to recycle?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, there's a Canadian company called Li-Cycle that they're hugely into that. And in fact, part of the problem is they have to actually have stuff to recycle. If you remember all those curves I talked about in growth and use and whatnot, those are all recent. Well, batteries last a lot more than 10 years. So they actually have to get the source. Now, lithium-ion batteries have been around for a lot longer than 10 years in laptops and phones and just in single cells and whatnot. Those tend to be a little more difficult to recycle because they're so small and you have to have a collection facility to get to them. But larger battery storage, like those in EVs and grid storage especially, easy, because if it's time for the grid battery system to be recycled, well, you just load it up into an 18-wheeler, hopefully an electric one, and then you take it off to be recycled. And there are companies now that are lining up to do that, no question about it. In fact, they already are doing it, but the challenge is getting the supply. No question about it. Absolutely being done.
Awesome.
Speaking
Thank you so much. I appreciate all of that.
Eileen, did you have any other questions? Speaking of recycling, there has been a lot of really interesting questions in the chat on solar panel recycling as well. How, like, can they be recycled? Like, they can be recycled, but are they actually being recycled currently?
Yeah, that's I've heard that before as well. Well, it's there's a couple of things there. One is, I'm sure if you go to a dump somewhere, you'll probably look through it and you'll probably find a solar panel somewhere, for sure, no question about it. And so the question is, one, is there a good tight cycle that actually ensures they get recycled? There's a number of places in Europe already, countries, sorry, that actually are saying to manufacturers, when you produce something, you're responsible for the life cycle of that. So as soon as it starts, then you have to track it and make sure that that ends up back into being recycled again. Again, a part of the issue with solar panels is that they last a long time. So yes, especially solar panels. I think the new guarantee now is 25 years, but they'll last like easily 30. So solar panels have taken off in the last 15 years. Huge. Okay, well, what's the math? 15 more years before that huge bulk comes out. So yes, I don't think it's something. There's value in those solar panels, and the people will want to recycle them. But I think there's also it's important to make sure governments are legislating that as well. So it's more than just most of, but it's all or almost all of them. So I'm not saying it's perfect. Again, it's not perfect, but yes, there's lots of value in those solar panels that can be extracted, and there's a role there for government to make sure it's a high level of extraction.
I think that's a really important opinion on many things that are manufactured within the day, right? Even when we're talking about auto manufacturing, we've been talking a lot about laptops and cell phones and such
Yep.
like that. All of
Yep.
that it falls under those same realms. There's a bit of an interesting conversation about MB power happening in the chat as well. We've got 4.9 billion with a B deficit of NB power, 73% of which is a 3.6 billion. I almost said million, $1 billion Point LaPro. What about MB's power debt? How can it take on new projects given the debt load, and what is the priority in your opinion?
Yeah, they definitely have a debt to equity ratio problem, no question about it. And it makes you wonder, okay, so how can they do anything? Yeah, well, it means that we have to say, well, there's a transition here, and how can we get to this better spot where this source of energy is going to be less expensive? And yeah, that's a hump. In fact, in most of the things we're talking about around climate change, it's the cost of that transition that usually is the big barrier. You see that manifested in many ways. Like, for example, EVs. People say, oh yeah, I'd love to have one of those, but look at the cost, look at the entry cost. And that's just one small example. How do they get the money? Well, right now, I know that just generally the federal government's been offering all kinds of programs for funding transitional things like this. They're putting money into SMR program. Why are they doing that? Well, anyway, I won't get into that. So yes, there's they are strapped, and yes, it's interesting. They're strapped in big part because of the nuclear work they've done in the past, and that's cost them so much. They need to draw upon sources. I'm not going to say where those sources are coming from, but I suspect it's going to be largely the public purse, because in the end, it's the public's going to benefit from the fact that we can get to this lower cost of energy system. Yeah, I wish I had a much better silver bullet in that one, but
It
there's
seems
money
the
there.
silver bullets never prevail either way.
Yeah, there you
It's
go.
about a strategic, comprehensive understanding, right?
Right.
The one thing that I wanted to, because I work in climate action, and of course, with that, am bombarded with angry people who love to rally around disinformation or misinformation. My question is cold weather performance, because that's the one thing that comes up over and over again. We are a very cold and harsh climate. These renewables will never last, or they could never perform, or yada yada, et cetera, et cetera. What would your rebuttal be to that type of narrative?
Renewables will never last because we're in a cold climate. Well, let's
I'm
see.
thinking things like the battery production and like battery performance. We hear this a lot when we're talking about EVs and the electrification of our
Oh,
transportation
yeah.
systems as well.
Yeah. Well, guess we'll have to talk to some of those Nordic countries that are big users of EVs and as well as storage systems and renewables. they've certainly used lots of wind and even solar, um, and have mechanisms for storage. Now, again, when you talk about grid storage, lithium ion is one of the mechanisms, but there are many others. In fact, I just read that Finland is starting a seasonal thermal project where they're going to take their fourth largest city. I think it has a population of just over 200,000, and most of those people are on district heating. Well, they're going to create a thermal storage cavern that's going to provide heat for the winter for 90% of those people. And it's just, and they said, well, how can you afford to do that? Well, the thing is, the heat that's going to go in that cavern is mostly just waste heat during this. It's picked up during the summertime, so the heat is practically free, and the only cost is the storage. But the storage is so cheap. Again, this is in Finland. You're not known for the balmy beaches in Finland, so and they basically just pull it out during the wintertime. So storage has lots of different mechanisms. Lithium ion is one of them for sure, and it plays a role, no question about it. I have an EV. I've driven it for the last 5 years. Had an EV before that I drove, and I live in just outside of Fredericton, so I don't think it's particularly warm here during the winter, and I don't seem to have a problem. So yeah, there's all kinds of stories about things that work and don't, but and again, there'll always be the neat little stories you can pick on and magnify. But no, in terms of storage, cold is a factor, but it's easily overcome.
Wonderful. And we're almost at the top of the hour now, Tom. So much gratitude for you being here and sharing all of your insight and information and some really valuable opinions with us as well. As we move forward collectively, my last sentiment to you is, what can we take forward with us to help move in this direction? Like, what is something, could you share something that will empower the people here? Maybe a pearl of wisdom or a nice anecdote, so that when we are having these conversations at our kitchen tables or at the car dealership or waiting in line, so that we can effectively talk about this and work towards not only accelerating the transition, but thwarting some of those naysayers.
Wow. Yeah, it's I guess a pearl. One of the things I often think about is the idea of electrification is pretty pervasive, and usually everybody's bought into it, but they just don't know it yet. Even people like the whole thing around cars, for example. Should we have cars, or should we have some other mechanism for getting around? Because cars themselves are quite a consumable. But my point is always we need to focus on electrification of transport. So, and even better, just people power. Great, beautiful, active transportation. But if we need to have other power to move it around, let's have electric trains, let's have electric planes, let's have electric buses, whatever. And so one of the things that I often think about is the spectrum of solutions that can be covered off by electrification. And so that's where my mind tends to go. Hopefully
Wonderful.
that helps.
That is very helpful. Thank you, Tom. Susan also dropped a link in the chat for everybody who wants to sign up for the Cred NB monthly newsletter and become a Cred champion. There's always good wisdom in there as well, and calls to action that you can participate in. Again, so much gratitude for everybody being here and spending some time with us today. Tom, we look forward to hopefully having you back again in the future to continue that hydrogen conversation. It seems like that's our next timely conversation to happen. But
Super.
until then, I bid you adieu. I wish you all a wonderful and fruitful day today, and I hope to see you again in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.